Rome, in the middle of the 17th century, was a city of breathtaking beauty and suffocating darkness. It was a place where the scent of frankincense wafting from the basilicas mingled with the stench of open sewers and rotting refuse in the streets. But for half the population, the true horror wasn't found in the alleyways or the shadows of the Colosseum. It was found in the bedroom. It was found in the home. Imagine for a moment that you are a woman in this era. You are not a person, you are property. You are a transaction signed over from a father to a husband in a contract written in ink and sealed with gold. If your husband is kind, you are lucky, but if he is cruel, if he drinks until his eyes turn red, if he raises his fist to discipline you, if he treats you with less regard than the dog sleeping by the hearth, there is absolutely nowhere to run. The church says your vows are eternal. The state says his authority is absolute. To leave is a sin, to fight back is a crime. You are trapped in a gilded cage, waiting for old age or death to grant you a release. But in the quiet corners of the market, in the hushed whispers between washerwomen and noblewomen alike, a rumor began to spread. A secret solution for the desperate. It didn't come in the form of a weapon, a knife, or a hired thug. It came in a small, delicate glass vial. It looked innocent enough to sit openly on a vanity table, nestled between rosewater perfumes and face powders. It was labeled Manna of Saint Nicholas of Bari, a holy healing oil intended for the pious. But this was no holy water. It was a cosmetic for the soul, designed to scrub away the stain of a tyrannical husband. This is the story of Giulia Thofania, a woman who looked at the brutal, unyielding laws of patriarchy and decided to rewrite them with chemistry. She didn't sell hope. She sold widowhood. She invented a poison so perfect, so elegant, and so undetectable that it baffled the greatest physicians of the age. It was clear as spring water, tasteless as air, and slow enough to mimic a natural, tragic decline. With just 4 drops, administered over a few days, a woman could watch the color drain from her abuser's face. The first dose brought exhaustion, a simple fatigue that kept him in bed. The second brought stomach pains, chills, the kind of symptoms that summoned a priest, not a constable. The third dose was the beginning of the end, and the fourth was freedom. History calls her a monster, a serial killer, the mastermind behind a ring of death that claimed the lives of over 600 men. 600 husbands, fathers and sons, lowered into consecrated ground while their wives wept tears that were as artificial as the cosmetic that killed them. But to the women who bought her wares in the shadowy backstreets of Rome and Palermo, Giulia Thofania was not a villain. She was a savior. She was the only judge and jury who would listen to their pleas for mercy. However, in the world of shadows, no secret stays buried forever. The empire Giulia built on arsenic and belladonna was destined to shatter. And when it did, the fall was not just a stumble, it was a plummet into the deepest circles of hell. We are going to walk you through the damp stone corridors where this conspiracy thrived. We are going to examine the psychology of a woman who turned murder into a family business. And we will take you to the very end, to the betrayal, the panic over a bowl of soup, and the brutal, bone-breaking torture that finally ripped the truth from her throat. The execution of Giulia Thofania was not just a death. It was a spectacle designed to terrify a generation. This is a story of desperation, alchemy, and the terrifying lengths the human spirit will go to when it is caged. It is a dark chapter of history that feels uncomfortably intimate, a narrative of power dynamics that still resonates in the silence of modern domestic tragedies. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and leave a like, not just to help the channel, but because every interaction tells YouTube that stories like this deserve to be told. It ensures that the voices of the past, no matter how dark or complex, are not lost to the algorithm. Now let us turn back the clock to the sweltering heat of Palermo, where a young girl is about to learn that the difference between medicine and poison is often just a matter of intent. Let us open the vial. To understand the woman who would become the shadow of death in Rome, we must first travel south, far from the grand palaces of the Vatican. We must go to Palermo, Sicily, in the early 1630s. Here, the air is different. It is heavy with salt from the Mediterranean and thick with the dust of ancient sun-bleached stone. The heat in Palermo is a physical weight, pressing down on the narrow, labyrinthine streets where washing lines crisscross like spiderwebs between crumbling balconies. In this sweltering, chaotic world, Giulia is not a legend. She is simply a child. She is a girl with wide, observant eyes, small enough to hide under tables, quiet enough to become part of the furniture. If you look closely at the portrait of her childhood, you do not see a monster in the making. You see a terrified daughter clinging to the folds of her mother's skirt. Her mother is Thofania d'Adamo. To the neighbors, Thofania is a woman of strange habits, perhaps a little too independent, a little too knowledgeable about the wild herbs that grow in the rocky hillsides. But to young Giulia, she is the entire universe. Giulia watches her mother's hands, hands that are rough, stained with earth and plant juices, yet incredibly gentle when they brush the hair from Giulia's forehead. The kitchen is their sanctuary. It smells of rosemary, crushed garlic, and the sharp, acidic tang of lemons. But there are other smells too. Strange metallic scents, bitter aromas that make the back of Giulia's throat tighten. She watches as Thofania works with a mortar and pestle, grinding seeds and minerals into fine powders. To a child's eyes, this is not witchcraft. It is cooking. It is medicine. It is the way a woman imposes order on a chaotic world. But the chaos always finds a way in. The door slams. The heavy, uneven footsteps of a man echo on the stone floor. The atmosphere in the small house shifts instantly. The sunlight seems to dim. The scent of herbs is overpowered by the smell of stale wine and unwashed sweat. This is Giulia's father. History has not bothered to record his name with the same infamy as his wife or daughter, but his legacy is written in the bruises on Thofania's skin. Young Giulia learns the rhythm of violence early. She learns that love is not a shield. She learns to make herself small, to hold her breath until her lungs burn, praying that if she is quiet enough, the storm will pass over her. She hears the shouting, the sickening thud of flesh against flesh, the muffled sobs that follow. She sees her mother, the strong, magical woman who can distill essences from flowers, reduced to a cowering, broken thing on the floor. Night after night, the lesson is hammered into the girl's psyche. In this world, men are the hammers and women are the nails. There is no police force to call. There are no shelters. The priest tells her mother to bear her cross with patience. The law tells her father he has the right to chastise his property. Then the dynamic shifts. The grinding in the kitchen becomes more intense. Thofania stops crying and starts calculating. The fear in her eyes is replaced by a cold, steely resolve. Giulia watches as her mother mixes a new solution, carefully measuring out drops of a clear, tasteless liquid. It is arsenic, derived from the bleaching agents used by cosmetic shops, mixed with belladonna. When the father falls ill, it is slow, it is agonizing. But for Giulia, sitting in the corner of the room, it is confusing. The man who was a giant of terror is suddenly weak. He groans, he vomits, he withers away until he is nothing more than a husk. And then the house is silent. The fear is gone. But the silence is short-lived. The year 1633 tears the sky apart. The secret is discovered. Thofania d'Adamo is accused of poisoning her husband. The justice system moves with a speed and ferocity it never showed when she was being beaten. Giulia, barely a teenager, stands in the crowd and watches the final act of her childhood. The execution of Thofania is a visceral public spectacle. The sensory overload is traumatic. The jeering of the crowd, the smell of unwashed bodies pressing against her, the sight of the executioner, and the final jerking movements of the woman who was her only protector. In that moment, as the life leaves her mother's body, something fractures inside Giulia. She is left entirely alone in a world that has just proven how cruel it can be. She is an orphan, the daughter of a murderess, branded by shame, but she is also the daughter of a survivor. She returns to the empty house, to the silence, to the jars and vials left on the table. She runs her fingers over the cool glass. She realizes that her mother didn't leave her money. She didn't leave her land. She left her something far more valuable. She left her the recipe. Giulia Thofania didn't wake up one day and decide to be evil. She was forged in the fires of domestic terror. She looked at the recipe her mother died for, and she didn't see a weapon of mass destruction. She saw a shield. She saw the only thing that had ever stopped the beating. The young, innocent girl died on the scaffold with her mother in 1633. The woman who rose from those ashes was something else entirely. A woman who understood that in a world where justice is denied, it must be manufactured drop by drop. The transition from a traumatized daughter to the angel of death did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in the quiet, suffocating intimacy of a confessional that Giulia built for herself. She didn't just inherit a recipe, she inherited a mission. But what drove her, what truly fueled the engine of this conspiracy, was not greed. It was something far more potent, far more addictive, and far more dangerous. It was a twisted, burning form of empathy. Giulia was now a woman grown, possessing a sharp intellect and a beauty that masked the cold calculations of her mind. She moved through the world of women, the markets, the apothecaries, the church pews. And everywhere she looked, she saw reflections of her mother. She saw the flinch when her husband raised his voice. She saw the heavy makeup applied to hide a darkening eye. She saw the trembling hands of young brides sold off to old lecherous merchants. The passion began with the first one. Perhaps it was a neighbor or a friend from the market. A woman came to Giulia, not for poison, but for comfort. She wept into her hands, telling stories of a husband who beat her until she couldn't stand, who spent her dowry on whores, who treated her children with contempt. She whispered the words that every trapped woman thought but never dared to say, "I wish he were dead." For most people, hearing this is a moment of pity. For Giulia, it was a call to arms. It was a lightning strike. She looked at this woman and felt a surge of power that was almost erotic in its intensity. She realized she held the key to the cage. She didn't offer a weapon. That would be crude. That would be dangerous. Instead, she offered the aqua Thofania. She offered it with the reverence of a priest offering the Eucharist. The bottle was beautiful, delicate, adorned with the image of Saint Nicholas of Bari. It was a masterpiece of blasphemy. To the outside world, it was a holy oil, a devotional object to be kissed and prayed over. To the initiated, it was liquid widowhood. When that first client returned, the change was intoxicating. The woman was no longer hunched and terrified. She was dressed in black, yes, but her eyes were clear. Her back was straight. She was free. She gripped Giulia's hands and called her a savior. She called her a saint. That was the hook. That was the addiction. It wasn't the money, though the money flowed in rivers of gold. It was the validation. It was the feeling of playing God. Giulia became addicted to the transformation. She fell in love with the act of liberation. Every time she handed over a vial, she wasn't just selling a product. She was correcting a mistake made by the universe. She was balancing the scales of a cruel world. This obsession drove her to perfect the formula. She became an artist of death. She refined the arsenic mixture, removing the metallic taste, ensuring it was odorless, colorless, and absolutely transparent. It had to be slow. It had to mimic the natural wasting diseases of the time: consumption, dysentery, gastric fevers. It required patience. It required a cold, steely discipline. Giulia taught her clients like a director coaching an actress. She taught them how to administer the drops in soup or wine. She taught them how to feign concern as their husbands grew pale and weak. She taught them how to call the doctor, how to demand the best care, how to weep at the bedside so that no suspicion would ever fall upon them. It became a secret society, a dark sisterhood bound by blood and silence. The passion spread from Giulia to her daughter, Girolama, and to a small circle of trusted associates. They weren't just criminals, they were believers. They justified every death. They whispered to themselves that these men deserved it. They convinced themselves that they were the hand of divine justice, striking down the wicked. But deep down, there was a darker psychological current pulling them under. To kill once is a tragedy. To kill 600 times is a pathology. The power became absolute. Giulia Thofania held the lives of Rome's men in the palm of her hand. She walked the streets, nodding to noblemen who had no idea that their wives carried her death warrant in their pockets. She looked at the grand patriarchy of Italy, the popes, the princes, the merchants, and she smiled. Because she knew that for all their stone walls and armies, they were vulnerable to a few drops of water in their evening broth. This was her romance. This was her love affair, not with a man, but with the secret. The thrill of the double life was electric. By day, a pious woman mixing cosmetics. By night, the mastermind of a massacre. She couldn't stop because stopping would mean admitting she was a murderer. As long as she kept going, as long as the next woman came crying to her door, begging for help, she could maintain the illusion that she was a hero. She was drunk on the gratitude of widows. She was high on the subversion of the law. And like all addicts, she needed the dose to get higher and higher. The network expanded. The whispers grew louder. The vials traveled from the slums to the palaces. And in the heat of this obsession, in the arrogance of her success, Giulia forgot the one rule that governs all secrets. Eventually, someone always talks. Rome in the 1650s was a city of secrets, but even the deepest graves eventually run out of room. For nearly 20 years, Giulia Thofania had operated in the blind spot of the law. She had turned the act of murder into a phantom, a ghost that slipped through keyholes and dissolved in wine glasses. But you cannot remove 600 men from the population of a city without disturbing the water. You cannot create an army of young, wealthy, and strangely cheerful widows without drawing the gaze of the wolves. The first sign of the end was not a shout, but a murmur. It began in the churches. Priests, sitting in the dark confessionals, began to hear the same trembling admissions over and over again. They heard the guilt of women who had solved their marital problems with a miraculous oil. They saw the sudden influx of funerals for healthy men. Men in the prime of their lives who had been strong as oxen on Tuesday and dead by Friday. The bells of Rome seemed to be tolling constantly. The scent of funeral lilies became as common as the smell of baking bread. And in the corridors of the Vatican, powerful men began to grow uneasy. The papal authorities were not fools. They were the architects of the Inquisition. They were men who saw the devil in every shadow. They noticed the pattern. They noticed that death was becoming gendered. It was striking down the husbands, but sparing the wives. A low-level panic began to spread through the male aristocracy. It was a cold, creeping paranoia. A husband would look across the dinner table at his wife, the woman he had beaten the night before, and wonder why she was smiling. He would look at the glass of wine she poured for him and wonder if the light caught it strangely. The power dynamic was shifting. The fear that Giulia had banished from the hearts of women was now taking root in the hearts of men. The authorities began to tighten the net. They didn't know who she was yet, this queen of poison. But they knew she existed. Spies were dispatched into the markets. The papal police, the sbirri, began to harass the local apothecaries, turning over jars, tasting powders, looking for the source of this invisible plague. The air in Rome grew heavy with suspicion. Every loose tongue was a liability. Every client was a potential traitor. Giulia Thofania felt the change. The shadows she had used for cover were beginning to thin. She moved her operation, constantly shifting locations, relying on the loyalty of her daughter and her assistants. But a conspiracy of this size is like a dam holding back an ocean. Eventually, a single hairline fracture will bring the whole wall crashing down. That fracture didn't come from a brilliant detective or a lucky raid. It came from a bowl of soup. It is almost absurd that an empire of death built over decades would crumble because of a single moment of hesitation over a dinner course. A wealthy woman, one of Giulia's newest clients, had purchased the Acqua Thofania. She was desperate. She was terrified of her husband. She had the vial. She had the instructions. She had the opportunity. It was a quiet evening. The candles flickered on the table, casting long, dancing shadows against the tapestries. The husband sat down to eat. The wife had prepared his soup, carefully lacing it with the colorless, tasteless drops, just as Giulia had taught her. It was perfect. It was lethal. The husband picked up his spoon. He dipped it into the broth. He raised it to his lips. And in that split second, the human element, the one variable Giulia could never fully control, intervened. The wife panicked. Perhaps it was a sudden surge of Catholic guilt, the fear of hellfire. Perhaps it was a lingering shred of affection. Or perhaps it was just the terrifying reality of watching a man die by her own hand. She screamed. She lunged across the table and knocked the spoon from his hand. "Don't eat it!" she shrieked. The sound shattered the domestic silence. The soup splashed onto the floor, steaming in the cool air. The husband, startled and confused, looked at the mess, then at his wife's pale, trembling face. He saw the terror in her eyes, and he understood. The rumors he had heard, the whispers at the tavern, the sudden deaths of his friends, it all crystallized in that moment. He didn't hug her. He didn't ask for an explanation. He grabbed her. He beat her until the truth spilled out of her along with the blood. He dragged her, hysterical and broken, to the papal authorities. That night, under the harsh light of an interrogation room, the dominoes began to fall. The wife, terrified of being burned at the stake as a witch, gave them the only thing she had left to trade. She gave them a name: Giulia Thofania. The name echoed through the halls of the Vatican like a thunderclap. The hunt was on. The shadows were no longer a refuge. They were a trap. The police mobilized with a fury reserved for heretics and cop killers. They weren't just coming to arrest a criminal. They were coming to crush a rebellion. The city of Rome, once Giulia's playground, had become her cage, and the door was about to be kicked in. Word of the betrayal traveled faster than the papal guards. In the dead of night, a warning reached Giulia Thofania. The authorities were coming. The torches were already burning in the streets, a river of fire flowing toward her home. She had minutes, perhaps seconds. She didn't pack. She didn't run to the harbor. She ran to the only place she thought would offer sanctuary, the church. She fled through the cobbled alleyways, her breath tearing at her throat, the sound of heavy boots echoing behind her. She threw herself upon the mercy of a local convent, begging for asylum. The nuns, moved by her desperation, or perhaps unaware of her crimes, took her in. For a brief moment it seemed the storm had passed. The church was sacred ground. By ancient law, the soldiers could not enter. But Rome was in a frenzy. The rumor mill was spinning out of control. The story had mutated. People were whispering that Giulia Thofania hadn't just poisoned husbands. They said she had poisoned the city's water supply. Panic is a powerful accelerant. The mob didn't care about sanctuary laws. They didn't care about the sanctity of the church. They wanted blood. A crowd gathered outside the convent walls. It was a sea of angry faces, illuminated by the flickering orange light of torches. They chanted, they threw stones. The pressure mounted until the unthinkable happened. The soldiers, emboldened by the mob and the fury of the Pope himself, breached the sanctuary. They dragged Giulia out. There was no dignity in her capture. She was hauled through the streets like a trophy, the crowd spitting and jeering at the woman they now called a witch. She was thrown into the Castel Sant'Angelo, the grim fortress that had swallowed the enemies of the Vatican for centuries. The heavy iron doors slammed shut, sealing her in darkness, and then the nightmare truly began. The interrogation of Giulia Thofania was not a conversation. It was a systematic dismantling of a human being. In the 17th century, torture was not just a method. It was an art form, practiced with cold, bureaucratic precision. They strapped her to the rack, a device designed to stretch the body until the joints popped from their sockets like corks from a bottle. Imagine the sound of ropes tightening, the creak of wood, the sudden, blinding white agony as shoulders and hips are pulled beyond their natural limits. They wanted names. They wanted the network. They wanted a confession that would justify the public spectacle they were planning. Giulia held out as long as her body allowed, but pain has a way of bypassing the will. Under the agony of the rack, amidst the smell of damp stone and her own blood, the truth was ripped from her throat. She confessed to the murders of over 600 men. She named her assistants, she named her daughter. The trial was a formality. The verdict was written before the ink was dry. Death. In July of 1659, the final act played out in the Campo dei Fiori, the Field of Flowers, a square that had seen the burning of heretics like Giordano Bruno. But there were no flowers that day, only the stench of fear and the roar of the crowd. Giulia, her daughter Girolama, and 3 of their most loyal assistants were led to the scaffold. They were broken women, their bodies ravaged by the torture chamber, barely able to stand. But Giulia did not weep. Accounts say she faced the end with a terrifying calm. The executioner was waiting. The method was the garrote, a strangulation device. It was intimate. It was slow. The executioner placed the cord around Giulia's neck. He began to twist the handle. The crowd fell silent, watching the life be squeezed out of the woman who had sold death in a bottle. Her face turned purple, her eyes bulged, her hands clawed at the air. It was a visceral, ugly, suffocating end. But the horror didn't stop with her death. The authorities wanted to send a message that would echo through history. They took her body, still warm, and threw it over the wall of the church that had tried to protect her. It was a final insult, a desecration. Her corpse was left to rot in the open air, a grim warning to any woman who dared to challenge the natural order. Her accomplices were executed beside her, and then the purge began. The lower-class clients were rounded up and hanged. But the wealthy women, the duchesses and countesses who had bought the poison, they were quietly walled up in the dungeons of the Palazzo Pucci, imprisoned in darkness for the rest of their lives, their names erased from family trees. The piazza was washed clean of blood, but the stain remained. The legend of Giulia Thofania was sealed not in ink, but in the collective nightmare of Rome. She was the woman who had turned the domestic sphere into a slaughterhouse. And as the sun set over the city that night, 600 ghosts watched from the shadows, finally avenged, while 1,000 surviving husbands slept with one eye open, wondering if the water in the pitcher was truly just water. History is usually written in ink, signed by judges and popes, and stored in dry, dusty archives. But the story of Giulia Thofania is written in smoke. It is a narrative composed of whispers, contradictions, and shadows that refuse to be illuminated by the harsh light of fact. While the official records state that Giulia was executed in the Campo dei Fiori in July of 1659, strangulated alongside her daughter and thrown over a church wall, there is a persistent, nagging silence in the timeline. Strange anomalies exist in the historical texts. Some accounts from the era claim that Giulia Thofania was still alive well into the 1700s. They speak of a woman living in a convent in Naples, or perhaps imprisoned in the deepest dungeons of the Inquisition, kept alive not for punishment, but for her knowledge. Did she really die on that scaffold? Or was the woman in the noose a decoy? Was it merely a scapegoat offered up to appease the bloodlust of the Roman mob, while the true alchemist slipped away into the anonymity of a cloister? It is a terrifying what if. Imagine the authorities realizing that her knowledge was too dangerous to lose, or perhaps too valuable to destroy. Imagine Giulia, old and grey, mixing her final solutions in the candlelight of a prison cell, the ghost of her own legend haunting her every breath. The fear she ignited certainly survived her. The name Thofania became a synonym for death itself, a brand name that transcended borders and centuries. Over 100 years later, in 1791, the great composer Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart lay on his deathbed in Vienna. His body was swelling, his skin turning a sickly grey, his mind consumed by paranoia. In his final, delirious hours, he didn't speak of disease. He spoke of her. He whispered to his wife, "I am sure that I have been poisoned. Someone has given me aqua Thofania and calculated the precise time of my death." Whether Mozart was truly poisoned or merely succumbed to illness is irrelevant. The fact remains that a century after she supposedly died, Giulia Thofania was still the first name on the lips of dying men. She had become the boogeyman of the patriarchy, the invisible phantom standing in the corner of every unhappy marriage in Europe. As we look back at the trail of 600 bodies, we are left with a moral equation that is impossible to balance. It is easy to look at the numbers and see a monster. 600 lives, 600 stolen futures. It is the work of a serial killer on a scale that rivals modern warfare. But then, we must look at the context. We must look at the bruises. We must remember the world that created her, a world where a woman was legally less than a person, where she could be beaten, raped, and imprisoned in her own home with the blessing of the church and the state. Giulia Thofania did not invent violence, she merely redistributed it. She took the power of life and death, which had been the exclusive right of men for millennia, and she bottled it for women. Was she a cold-blooded profiteer who capitalized on misery? Or was she a dark revolutionary, running an underground railroad for the abused, where the only destination was widowhood? Perhaps she was both. History is rarely painted in black and white. It is painted in shades of grey, and sometimes in clear, tasteless drops of arsenic. The tragedy of Giulia Thofania is not just the murders she committed, but the society that made her necessary. She is a mirror held up to a brutal age, reflecting the terrifying lengths to which the powerless will go to regain control. Her legacy is a question that hangs in the air, as heavy and unresolved as the humidity in a Palermo summer. It forces us to ask where the line is drawn between justice and vengeance, between a cure and a poison. So, as we close the book on this dark chapter of Italian history, I turn the final judgment over to you. Look at the facts, look at the desperation, and look at the body count. Do you think they were a victim or a villain? Let me know in the comments. If you want to uncover more dark secrets from the history books that they didn't teach you in school, click the video on your screen right now. The next story is waiting, and it is even darker than this one.